Good evening. Time doesn't work against Israel, actually. Actually, time works for Israel, contrary to the basic belief. You know that inside, the time works against Israel, and that actually characterizes especially those people who are in the center or who are in the right, and to try and justify their support, their current support of 2 states for 2 nations. How do they justify? Justify it by claiming that time works against us for 2 reasons: American pressure, which ostensibly we cannot withstand, and the second reason they give is those people, yes, who have moved to the left and have started supporting a Palestinian state. Another claim is that maybe it's as if the Jews have been condemned to always be a minority between the Jordan and the sea, and therefore we have no choice but to give up that Jewish geography, Judea and Samaria, in order to prove that Jewish demography. Now, these 2 assumptions are wrong by their very nature. And as in every logical calculation, if the assumptions are wrong, then the conclusion is wrong. And I will try and clarify to you in the time that I have why these 2 assumptions are mistaken, and why, in fact, time works in our favor and not against us. So there's no need to expand in a matter, in the evaluation that says that the president is not really one of our fans, and that he's not one of those supporters of Israel. And he definitely is not a main player and does not try and bring us, turn the Muslim states into our friends, and he does not see Israel as a strategical tool, and so forth and so forth and so forth, and such disadvantages as far as his approaches go. But as far as his world conception is concerned, and despite his perceptions, and despite that elite media in the United States, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the CNN, the NBC, CBS, ABC, etc., despite what is happening on the campuses, it is a fact, and I don't think anyone disputes this. I think one public opinion survey after survey in recent years, and especially in this last year, proves that the status of Israel as a unique ally and beloved, and a beloved one, loved by the American people, is still very stable. That status is still there. It is rooted, it is inherent, and it has even reached peaks in the past years, in spite of what is happening in the countries around us. And these surveys, it's not just a Gallup, it's also Rasmussen that is not, Quinnipiac and, those other companies. But the Super Poll, that survey, is basically that survey that takes place every single day in Capitol Hill. And we have seen time and time again that when we have seen again votes for and against Israel, about 75% of the Congress support Israel, about 70% of the Senate support Israel, and this is even better than the 68% or 65% or 70% that support of supporters in the Israeli public. That actually says that we are one of the 5 or 7 nations that are most loved by the American nation. And the question is why? And in order to understand the American foreign policy in general and its approach to Israel in particular, we have to understand the internal feeling thinking and of the Americans and the internal policy of America. And unfortunately, as we've seen here, different ministries and academia and media, we cannot have these expert journalists, experts in American foreign policy, but don't really deal in internal affairs because it's not their field of expertise, and they don't understand that in order to understand, for example, the foreign policy of Israel, you have to understand what is a Jewish state, what is Jewish history, and then we might understand the foreign policy of the Jewish state. And in one long sentence, in order to try and understand that the spirit of things, or the way of thinking of that critical mass of Americans, we have to understand that the American way of thinking is not New York or Los Angeles, it's not Hollywood, and again, it is not that elite media. It is that huge sandwich between those two shores. And when we analyze what is that spirit, what is that way of thinking that is responsible for the fact that George Bush Jr. Actually was in office twice, and Nixon was in office twice, and Reagan was in office twice, this spirit or this way of thinking is actually based on a belief of religion and patriotism and independence, and actually mocks the United Nations, is hostile towards the United Nations, and actually is very suspicious of Muslim countries and Arab countries and the Islam religion and Islam religion. And it is, by its very nature, it is anti-terrorism, and it sees in Israel a manifestation of all those values that they believe in. Even more so, we can say that what gave Reagan so much affection also gives us that affection to a certain extent. Ronald Reagan, we are sort of the Ronald Reagan of the international community, definitely of the Middle East, but as I said, we are the Ronald Reagan of the international community, meaning, that beloved son. And in order to understand the force and the power of the American public, we have to understand the method of the American administration, that federal system. And first and foremost, to understand the president is not the administration, as is usually kind of interpreted here in Israel. The president is one branch, one out of three of the administration, and each and every branch is equal one to the other, and I would like to emphasize that. And the other is equal to the branch of the president branch, the White House branch, or the administration. All these are equal in every topic regarding, including national security. But it is important to understand that the main axis of the system is that critical masses between the shores, meaning that American voter. So in contrast to every other parliamentary system, including that very miserable system that we have here in Israel, according to the federal system, the central axis is not the president, it is definitely not the party, not the Congress, not the courts, but the voter. And that is why there are elections every 2 years, and that is why that cry of the American voter, we shall remember in November, that is definitely a cry that shakes the very foundations of every single office and every single ministry in Congress, and they take it very seriously. And that is why the very foundations of the Senate and the Congress express the desire and will of the public in almost everything, but inter alia, but I would say especially regarding Israel. And why in this time this polarity is so, it's almost unprecedented between the two parties, between the two houses, except for a very small number of topics. There's the support of the American soldiers, that American patriotism, and among those 4 or 5 areas that have very little common factor is that affection towards Israel. And in order to understand the power of Congress as a representative of that affection that the public has towards Israel, we have to understand the strength of the Congress. And again, in contrast to what is acceptable in our area, when we say, yes, that is an internal matters, yes, it has to do with budgets, But everybody knows, and by the way, when I hear everybody knows, everybody says, I know that is great insecurity. When somebody says, everybody says, well, no, that shows that you're insecure. So people tell us everybody knows that the president is the leader. He leads everything except for security. So the Vietnam War, it was the Congress that put an end to the Vietnam War. It was called Eagle Toad. And the American involvement in Angola and Nicaragua, the Congress put an end to that as well, and not the president. Boland and Clark amendments, you know those. And the opening of the gates of the Soviet Union, I mean, it wasn't the State of Israel that brought about this, nor the American president, but it was some sort of a bill of the Congress, Jackson Valley, that was legislated despite Jerusalem, and despite the White House, the Congress decided that any financial support to Soviet Union will be given only on condition that the gates open, and that is why the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia was formed. Russia needed support. Yes, they wanted support. They needed assistance, and they said, okay, open your gates. What is the result? More than 1 million Jews that came to Israel because of the Congress and its power. So, and when Congress decided that American intelligence actually crossed all the red lines, all borders, it actually established the Pike and Church committees, and they actually castrated, in a manner of speaking, all the intelligence branches, and no president helped, no state of secretary helped, because that is the power of Congress. And I can expand on that, but I don't have the time. And let me say, yes, it is right. It is right that the Congress, the House of Representatives, the Senate, they really do prefer to deal with the local things and the internal affairs that they represent. Well, that is why they were sent to Washington. And if they deal in those matters, they will be re-elected. And if they take care and deal again in external matters, foreign matters like peace between Israel and Israel, will it bring any sort of dividend to them, a local dividend? So of course, we know that congressmen prefer that the president deal with the foreign policy, and they deal in local matters. Until the president suddenly crosses the lines, until the president is no longer loyal, until the president deviates from his authority, or until the voters cry out loud and alert their attention, until when suddenly that sword is placed on their neck, then suddenly the White House or the congressmen cry out as well, as we saw time and time again during the time of Ben-Gurion, Tul Shamir. And again, this did not happen from time of Rabin till this day, till Netanyahu. Again, we have not seen at all, we have not leveraged the Congress, except for a few nice speeches that we've seen of late. Again, I think it was a terrible waste of such a waste, such a loss. By the way, he gets A+ in terms of speaking and the art of orating, but nothing in terms of content. Again, so the Central Access supports us. The delegates and representatives in the House of Representatives, they support us. And even when a president, just like he wanted a few months ago in the election about settlers to heard us, and he wanted to add that American vote to that condemnation, he couldn't do it because Congress said to him, you have to place a veto. And in order to express his opinion, President Obama sent Hillary Clinton and Cecil Rice, and they, on his behalf, held these horrible, hostile speeches against settlements. That is Obama's approach, but Congress didn't allow him to speak like that. So I didn't mention this earlier. I mean, he can be elected again. He can be elected again. It must be clear to everybody. In contrast, again, to another insight, again, a president of who gets a second, who has a second cadence is usually a weaker president. It actually runs counter to what most people think. But again, the American system is different. The president reaches his peak on the day of election to the second presidency, and from the day that he's elected the second time, he's actually all downhill, and from day